The winter of 1978 hit Montana harder than anyone could remember. By mid-November, temperatures had already dropped to 20 below zero, and the snowdrifts were climbing past first-floor windows across Stillwater County. While families rushed to supermarkets, panic-buying canned goods and fighting over the last bags of rice, 72-year-old Walter Henrickson sat on his porch, smoking his pipe, watching his neighbors load their trunks with whatever they could find. He didn't say much. He never did. But there was something in his eyes, not smugness, not superiority, just the quiet confidence of a man who had prepared for exactly this moment 30 years earlier. Walter's underground pantry had been the joke of Absaroki since 1948. When he started digging that massive hole behind his barn, folks thought he'd lost his mind. His own brother called it Walt's tomb. The county inspector tried to stop him, citing some regulation about unauthorized excavation, but Walter kept digging. Every evening after working his small wheat farm, he'd spend 3 hours moving earth one shovelful at a time. No excavator, no help, just an old man, a spade, and a stubborn refusal to explain himself to anyone. If you're watching this, wondering how one man's ridiculous idea became the difference between survival and starvation for an entire community, make sure you're subscribed to this channel, because what happens next will change how you think about self-reliance forever. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss how this story unfolds. The following story is presented as a narrative reconstruction. Walter Henrickson had learned about hunger the hard way. As a boy during the Great Depression, he'd watched his mother water down soup until it was practically transparent, trying to make one chicken stretch across 9 days. He remembered the hollow feeling in his stomach, the way his sister's cheeks sank inward, the silence at the dinner table when there was nothing to say because there was nothing to eat. Those memories carved themselves into his bones, and when he came back from the war in 1946, he made himself a promise. He would never be hungry again, and neither would anyone who came to his door. But Walter didn't trust the modern world's solutions. He'd seen too much, survived too much to believe that grocery stores would always have food, or that supply chains would never break. So in the spring of 1948, he started digging. The hole began as a modest depression behind his barn, maybe 6 feet across. But as the months turned into years, it grew into something extraordinary. Walter dug down 12 feet, then expanded outward, creating a cavern roughly 40 feet long and 20 feet wide. He reinforced the walls with timber from trees he felled himself, cutting and planing each board by hand. He installed ventilation shafts made from old stovepipes, positioned to catch the prevailing wind and keep air circulating. He built shelving from rough-cut pine, creating hundreds of linear feet of storage space. The whole operation took him 4 years of after-work labor, and when he finally finished in 1952, people were still laughing. "Walt's building his tomb," they'd say at the Mineshaft Tavern. "Man's gonna bury himself alive with a bunch of turnips." Even his wife Dorothy had her doubts. "Walter, honey, we've got a perfectly good root cellar under the house," she'd said more than once. "Why do you need something big enough to store food for the entire county?" Walter would just pull on his pipe and say, "Might need it someday, Dottie. Might need it someday." What nobody understood, what nobody could see because they weren't paying attention, was that Walter was building something far more sophisticated than a hole in the ground. He'd positioned the entrance on the north side of a small hill, where it would stay shaded even in summer. He'd sloped the floor slightly toward a drainage channel that carried away any moisture. He'd created different zones within the space, a cool section for root vegetables, a drier area for grains and dried goods, a slightly warmer zone near the entrance for items that needed less extreme preservation. Everything about the design showed a deep, intuitive understanding of how temperature, humidity, and airflow worked together to keep food fresh. And then there was Walter's approach to stocking it. Every year he grew more than his family needed. Potatoes, carrots, turnips, beets, cabbage, onions. He planted with the kind of excess that made other farmers shake their heads. He'd harvest everything at the perfect moment when root vegetables had reached their peak sugar content, but before the first hard frost could damage them. He never washed them. Instead, he'd brush off the loose dirt and pack them in sand or sawdust, creating layers of insulation that regulated moisture and prevented spoilage. Potatoes went into wooden bins filled with dry sand. Carrots and beets were laid in boxes between layers of sawdust. Cabbages hung from the ceiling in old burlap sacks, spaced just far enough apart that air could circulate around them. He dried everything else. Beans hung in the barn until they were brittle. Then he'd shell them by hand and store them in glass jars with hand-carved wooden lids. Apples from his 3 old trees were sliced thin and laid on screens in the sun, turning into sweet, leathery rings that would last for years. He even dried meat, venison and elk from his annual hunts, cutting it into strips, salting it heavily, and hanging it in the driest part of his pantry until it became hard as leather and nearly imperishable. The grain storage was perhaps his greatest achievement. Walter had built large wooden bins with slanted floors and small doors at the bottom, allowing him to pour in wheat, oats, and corn from the top while drawing out older grain from the bottom. This rotation meant nothing ever sat long enough to spoil or attract pests. He'd sealed every crack in those bins with a mixture of pine tar and sawdust, creating an airtight barrier against moisture and insects. Once a month, he'd go down there with a lamp, check every container, rotate anything that needed rotating, and remove any sign of mold or deterioration before it could spread. By 1978, Walter's pantry held an almost unbelievable quantity of food. There were bins of wheat berries and oats that went back 5 years. Hundreds of pounds of potatoes, carrots, and turnips from the previous fall's harvest. Jars of dried beans in every variety. Strings of dried apples and strips of venison. Crocks of sauerkraut that Dorothy made every autumn. Even a section of honey harvested from the wild hives Walter had found in the hills, stored in old whiskey jugs sealed with wax. But food was only part of Walter's preparation. He'd also stored seeds, hundreds of varieties, each type kept in small cloth bags labeled in his careful handwriting. If something catastrophic happened, he reasoned, these seeds would be worth more than gold. He had heritage wheat that his grandfather had brought from Norway, pole beans that had been in Dorothy's family for generations, potatoes that could survive Montana's short growing season, carrots that stored well into spring. All of it organized, labeled, and protected from moisture and pests. People still laughed, though. As late as October 1978, Walter's nephew had made a crack about the doomsday pantry at a family dinner. Uncle Walt's got enough food down there to survive the apocalypse, he'd said, rolling his eyes. Meanwhile, there's a perfectly good supermarket 12 miles away. Walter had just smiled and cut another piece of Dorothy's apple pie. Then November came, and with it, the cold. The first week wasn't unusual. Montana always got snow before Thanksgiving. But the second week brought temperatures that made old-timers nervous. 20 below, then 25 below. The third week it hit 30 below zero, and the snow didn't stop. Roads became impassable. The highway to Billings closed. The supermarket in Absaroki ran out of bread on a Tuesday and couldn't get a delivery truck through until Saturday. Except Saturday's truck never came. Neither did the next one. By early December, people were getting worried. The store's shelves looked picked over, gaps where the canned goods had been, empty dairy cases, no fresh produce at all. The owner tried to stay optimistic. Trucks coming tomorrow, he'd say. Roads are clearing up. But the trucks didn't come tomorrow, or the next day, or the day after that. That's when people started remembering Walter's pantry. At first, it was just a few jokes down at the tavern, nervous laughter about how old Walt might have been onto something. But as December wore on and the cold didn't break and the shelves got emptier, the jokes stopped. The first person to knock on Walter's door was Emma Richardson, a widow who lived 3 houses down. She came on a Thursday morning embarrassed, holding her empty hands in front of her like she was trying to explain something she didn't quite understand herself. "Walter, I hate to ask," she said, her breath fogging in the brutal cold. "But I'm down to my last can of soup, and the store says they don't know when the next truck's coming through." Walter didn't hesitate. He pulled on his coat and led her around to the back of the barn, to the wooden door built into the hillside. He'd designed it to be almost invisible, just rough timber that blended with the landscape. But when he pulled it open, warm air rolled out, carrying the earthy smell of stored potatoes and the sweet scent of dried apples. Emma gasped. The pantry stretched out before her like a vision from another era. Lamplight glinted off rows and rows of glass jars. Wooden bins overflowed with root vegetables. Strings of dried apples hung from the ceiling like strange, sweet stalactites. Sacks of grain stood stacked against one wall, each one labeled in Walter's careful hand. "Take what you need," Walter said simply. Emma walked through the space like she was in a cathedral, her eyes wide. Walter filled a box for her. Potatoes, carrots, dried beans, a string of apples, even a jar of Dorothy's sauerkraut. He added a small bag of wheat berries and showed her how to cook them like oatmeal. "Walter, I can't possibly," Emma started, but Walter cut her off. "Winter's not over," he said. "You come back when you need more." Emma wasn't the last. Over the next week, as the cold deepened and the food shortage became impossible to ignore, more people came. Families Walter had known for decades. Young couples who'd just moved to Absaroki. Even his nephew, the one who'd made the crack about the doomsday pantry, showed up looking embarrassed and desperate, holding his infant daughter. Walter turned no one away. Some offered to pay. Walter refused. Some offered to work off the debt in the spring. Walter told them there was no debt. Some tried to apologize for laughing at him all those years. Walter said there was nothing to apologize for. "Food's meant to be eaten," he'd say, filling another box, another bag, another basket. No point in storing it if you're not going to use it when it matters. But even Walter's massive pantry had limits, and he knew it. If he gave freely to everyone who asked, the food would run out before spring. So he started teaching. When people came for supplies, Walter would walk them through the pantry, explaining his methods. He showed them how to store potatoes so they wouldn't sprout or rot. He demonstrated the proper way to pack carrots in sawdust. He explained why cabbage had to hang rather than sit, why onions needed air circulation, why root vegetables lasted longer when you didn't wash off all the dirt. He gave away not just food but seeds and knowledge, teaching people how to grow their own excess, how to preserve their harvests, how to build their own smaller versions of what he'd created. One evening, Doc Morrison showed up. He wasn't there for food. His family was fine. But he wanted to see what everyone was talking about. When Walter showed him through the pantry, the doctor stood there for a long moment just looking around. "Walter," he finally said, "do you realize what you've done here?" Walter shrugged. "Stored some food?" "No," Doc Morrison said. "You've kept this community alive. When the supply chains failed, when the modern system broke down, you were ready. You didn't just prepare for yourself, you prepared for all of us." Walter shifted uncomfortably. He'd never been good with praise. "Just seemed like the right thing to do," he muttered. But Doc Morrison wasn't finished. "You know what the real genius is? It's not just that you stored food, it's that you stored the right food, in the right way, in the right conditions. You've got varieties down here that'll keep for years. You've got seeds that people can plant. You've got knowledge that you're sharing. This isn't just survival, it's sustainability." That night, Doc Morrison called a community meeting at the church. 70 people showed up, stomping snow off their boots, breathing into their hands, wondering what this was about. "I think we need to talk about Walter Henrickson," Doc Morrison said. The room went quiet. "For 30 years we've laughed at Walt's pantry," the doctor continued. "We called it crazy, we called it excessive, we called it paranoid. But right now, in the middle of the worst winter in 50 years, with no food coming into town and no end in sight, that pantry is the only reason some of our neighbors aren't going hungry." People nodded. Some looked ashamed. "But here's the thing," Doc Morrison said. "Walt's not just giving away his food. He's teaching us how to do what he did. He's showing us that we don't have to depend on trucks and stores and supply chains that can break down. We can take care of ourselves." That meeting changed something in Absaroki. It wasn't just about getting through the current winter anymore. It was about making sure they'd never be this vulnerable again. People started planning their own pantries, their own storage systems. They asked Walter for advice, for seeds, for his knowledge about preservation and rotation and building techniques. He gave it all freely, but the winter wasn't done with them yet. In mid-January, the cold took a turn from severe to catastrophic. The thermometer outside Walter's kitchen window read 42 degrees below zero on a Wednesday morning. And it stayed there. The kind of cold that made trees explode with sounds like rifle shots. The kind of cold that froze diesel fuel in truck tanks and made metal so brittle it could snap like glass. The kind of cold that killed. The power went out on Thursday. Not just in Absaroki, across the entire county. Ice had built up on transmission lines until they came crashing down, and with the roads impassable, repair crews couldn't get through. The temperature inside houses dropped fast. Modern furnaces needed electricity to run their blowers and controls. Even the old oil furnaces wouldn't work without power to pump the fuel. Within hours, homes that had been warm started to feel the cold seeping in through walls and windows and floors. People burned what they could. Furniture, books, anything that would produce heat. But it wasn't enough, and everyone knew it. At 42 below, you could freeze to death in your own living room if you didn't have a heat source that could keep running day and night. Walter's house stayed warm. He'd installed a massive cast-iron wood stove in 1950, something he'd salvaged from an abandoned mining camp up in the hills. It didn't need electricity. It didn't need oil or gas. It just needed wood, and Walter had been cutting and splitting and stacking firewood every summer for 3 decades. Behind his barn stood cords and cords of seasoned pine and fir, enough to burn continuously for months. The first family showed up Friday morning. The Tolberts, with their 3 children, the youngest just 8 months old. Jim Tolbert's face was gray with fear and cold. "Walter, our furnace is out and we can't keep the house warm," he said, his voice shaking. "The baby. She's so cold, Walter. We didn't know where else to go." Dorothy already had blankets ready. She'd been expecting this. She wrapped the baby close and put her near the wood stove while Walter set up the Tolberts in the spare bedroom. By noon, there were 2 more families. By evening, there were 5. People sleeping in every room, on couches, on floors, anywhere they could fit near a heat source. Walter's house became a refuge. 15 people, then 20, then 25. He kept the wood stove burning around the clock, getting up every few hours through the night to add more logs. Dorothy cooked for everyone, stretching their supplies, making pots of soup and stew that could feed a crowd. And when their stored food in the house started to run low, Walter made trips to the pantry, coming back with his arms full of potatoes and carrots and dried beans. But it wasn't just about heat and food anymore. People were getting sick. The stress, the cold, the disruption. It was taking a toll. Old Mrs. Patterson developed a fever. One of the Tolbert children came down with a bad cough. Jim Tolbert's wife started showing signs of frostbite on her fingers from when they'd run out of fuel and spent a night in their freezing house before coming to Walter's. Doc Morrison was making rounds on foot, trudging through waist-deep snow to check on people, but he was running low on medical supplies. The pharmacy had been closed since the power went out. They couldn't keep their refrigerated medications cold enough, paradoxically, because their backup generators had failed. The doctor showed up at Walter's on Saturday evening, looking exhausted and worried. "I need to talk to you," he said quietly, pulling Walter aside. They went out onto the enclosed back porch, where they could speak privately. Even there, their breath fogged in the air. "It's not just Absaroki," Doc Morrison said. "I got through to Billings on the radio this morning. The whole region is shut down. Roads are closed across 3 states. They're calling it the worst winter storm in recorded history. People are dying, Walter, in their homes, in their cars, anywhere they got caught without heat." Walter pulled on his pipe, waiting. "You've got maybe 30 people staying in your house right now," the doctor continued. "But there are 200 more in this town, and at least half of them don't have reliable heat. If this cold keeps up, and the forecast says it will, we're going to lose people." "What are you suggesting?" Walter asked, though he already knew. "I'm suggesting we need to think bigger. We need a community shelter. Somewhere we can get everyone together, pool our resources, keep people warm and fed until this breaks." Walter thought for a long moment, smoking his pipe, looking out at the snow-covered landscape glowing blue in the moonlight. "The church," he finally said. "It's got that big old coal furnace in the basement. Thing's been there since 1910. Doesn't need electricity, just coal and someone to feed it." Doc Morrison's eyes lit up. Does it still work? Last I knew, Pastor Williams had it inspected a few years back, said it was still sound. Problem is coal. I don't know if anyone in town has enough coal to keep it running. But you do, the doctor said. It wasn't a question. Walter nodded slowly. Back in the 50s, when he was building his pantry and thinking about worst-case scenarios, he'd bought 5 tons of coal from a mine that was closing down. He'd stored it in a shed behind his barn, covered it with tarps, and mostly forgotten about it. Coal wasn't elegant or modern, but it didn't go bad, and it burned hot and long. I've got about 3 tons left, Walter said. Might be enough to get us through. They organized the move for Sunday morning. Walter hitched up his old draft horse, Sam, to a sled he'd built years ago for hauling firewood. The horse was 23 years old, massive and calm, and he moved through the deep snow like it was nothing. They loaded the sled with coal, and Walter drove it the half-mile into town, making trip after trip, while other men shoveled out the church and got the old furnace running. By Sunday afternoon, the church was warm, not comfortable. The building was too big and too drafty to get truly warm, but survivable. People started arriving in groups, carrying blankets and whatever food they had left. Walter made more trips, this time bringing supplies from his pantry. Sacks of potatoes, bins of carrots and turnips, jars of dried beans, smoked venison, bags of wheat and oats. He emptied almost a third of his carefully maintained stores and felt no regret at all. The church became a small village. Families claimed pews or sections of floor. Dorothy and some other women set up a cooking area in the church kitchen, using the old gas stove that still worked without electricity. Walter showed people how to cook wheat berries, how to make soup from dried beans and root vegetables, how to stretch their supplies. He organized teams to keep the furnace fed, teaching younger men how to bank the fire at night so it would burn slow and steady until morning. But it wasn't easy. 42 below zero doesn't care about human resilience or community spirit. The cold found every crack, every gap, every weakness in the church's old structure. People huddled in layers of blankets. Children cried from the cold. Old folks struggled with the temperature, their joints aching, their breathing labored in the dry, coal smoke-tinged air. On the 4th day, Emma Richardson's grandson, a boy of 7, went missing. One moment, he'd been playing with other children near the back of the church. The next, he was gone. His mother's scream brought everyone running. "He was just here! Michael! Michael!" People spread out, searching the church frantically. Walter moved methodically, checking every pew, every corner, every closet. He found the boy in the old storage room behind the altar, curled up in a cabinet, barely conscious. The child had wandered away from the group, gotten disoriented in the cold building, and tucked himself into a space where the heat couldn't reach. His lips were blue. His skin was ice cold. Walter scooped him up and carried him straight to the furnace room, the warmest spot in the building. He stripped off the boy's wet clothes. The child had apparently gone outside briefly before coming back in, and wrapped him in dry blankets, holding him close to his own body, using his warmth to bring the child's temperature back up. Doc Morrison arrived within minutes, checking the boy's vitals, watching for signs of hypothermia. "Is he going to be okay?" Michael's mother asked, her voice breaking. "He'll be fine," Doc Morrison said, but his eyes were serious when he looked at Walter. They both knew it had been close. Too close. That night, after Michael was sleeping peacefully with his mother, wrapped in every blanket they could find, Walter called a meeting of the adults. About 40 people gathered in a circle near the furnace room, sitting on pews they'd dragged over for warmth. "We need to talk about what happens if this doesn't end," Walter said. People shifted uncomfortably. Nobody wanted to think about that possibility. "I've been listening to the radio," Walter continued. "This storm system is stalled over the Rockies. The Weather Service can't say when it'll move. Could be days. Could be weeks. We need to plan for the worst case." "What are you suggesting?" Jim Tolbert asked. "Organization," Walter said. "Right now we're just a bunch of people trying to stay warm. We need to become a community that can sustain itself. That means rationing food properly, organizing work details, making sure everyone has a job, everyone contributes, everyone's accounted for." He pulled out a notebook, something he'd been working on. In his careful handwriting, he'd created a system: food rotation schedules, coal management protocols, teams for cooking, for cleaning, for maintaining the furnace, for checking on elderly and sick community members. He'd even calculated their supply situation, with careful rationing. The food from his pantry combined with what other families had brought could last about 6 weeks. People listened as Walter explained his plan. Some were skeptical at first, but as he talked, they began to understand. This wasn't about control or authority, it was about survival. And Walter wasn't asking anyone to do anything he wasn't already doing himself. They implemented the system that night: 3-person teams to feed the furnace on rotating shifts. A cooking schedule so meals were prepared efficiently. A strict rationing system where everyone got equal portions, no exceptions. Walter even created a schooling rotation, making sure the children had some structure and education while they waited out the storm. But the most important change was psychological. By giving people jobs and responsibilities, Walter had given them purpose. Instead of just enduring, they were participating. Instead of feeling helpless, they felt useful. The church stopped feeling like an emergency shelter and started feeling like a community. On the 8th day, something remarkable happened. The Johnsons, a couple in their 50s, announced they'd been secretly hoarding food in their house. Canned goods and dried pasta they'd panic bought before the storm. They'd been too embarrassed to admit it, too guilty about having extra when others had so little. But watching Walter give so freely from his own supplies had changed something in them. "We want to contribute," Mrs. Johnson said, her voice shaking. "We have maybe 20 pounds of pasta and 30 cans of vegetables. It's yours. The community's, I mean." Walter nodded slowly. "I'll add it to the inventory. Thank you." But something else happened after that confession. Other people came forward. A man admitted he had a case of canned soup in his basement. A woman revealed she'd been growing sprouts in jars at home and could teach others to do the same, creating fresh food even in winter. A retired teacher offered to organize the children's education more formally. A mechanic said he could probably get the church's old generator working if someone could get him parts. The community was learning to share, and in that sharing, they were becoming stronger. On the 10th day, the cold finally broke. The temperature climbed to 0, then to 10 above, then to 20. It felt like a heat wave after the brutal days of 40 below. Snow started to settle instead of blowing. The wind calmed. And on the morning of the 11th day, they heard a sound that made everyone stop and listen. A diesel engine. A snowplow was coming through, clearing the main road. Behind it came a convoy of trucks, National Guard vehicles carrying supplies, fuel, and medical support. The crisis was over. But as people began to pack up their things and prepare to return to their homes, something was different. They'd gone into that church as individuals and families, just trying to survive. They were leaving as a community that had learned to take care of each other. Pastor Williams stood at the front of the church that final evening before everyone dispersed. "I want to say something," he announced. The room quieted. "We've been through something terrible these past 2 weeks. We've been cold and scared and uncertain. But we've also learned something important. We've learned that we're stronger together than apart. We've learned that preparation isn't paranoia, it's wisdom. And we've learned that we have a man in this community who saw all this coming 30 years ago and spent 3 decades getting ready for it." He gestured to Walter, who was trying to disappear toward the back of the room. Walter Henrickson could have kept his pantry to himself. He could have let the rest of us figure it out. Instead, he shared everything: his food, his knowledge, his coal, his home, his time. He didn't just prepare for survival, he prepared for community. And that's why we're all still here. People started clapping. Walter looked uncomfortable, but Dorothy took his hand and squeezed it, and he managed a small nod. "I don't want thanks," Walter said when the applause died down. "I just want everyone to learn from this. Go home. Build your own pantries, not because you're preparing for the end of the world, but because you're preparing to take care of your family and your neighbors when times get hard. Because times will get hard again. They always do." As people filed out into the cold night, back toward homes that now had power and heat, Walter stayed behind to help clean up. He was banking the coal furnace one last time when Doc Morrison found him. "Walter, I've been thinking," the doctor said. "What you did here, what you taught us, it's too important to lose. Would you be willing to write it down? All of it. How to build a proper pantry, how to preserve food, how to organize a community in crisis. We need a guide, something people can reference." Walter considered this. "I'm not much of a writer." "Then talk. I'll write. But we need to preserve this knowledge." Walter looked around the church basement, at the old coal furnace still radiating heat, at the empty space where dozens of people had lived and eaten and survived together. "All right," he said. "I'll tell you what I know. The spring of 1979 brought more than just melting snow to Absaraki. It brought transformation. Every backyard that could hold a garden was planted with twice the usual crops. Behind houses across town, people were digging. Not massive caverns like Walter's, but practical root cellars, storage spaces, modest pantries built into hillsides and under porches. Walter spent that spring teaching. He'd show up at someone's property with his tools and his patient, quiet manner, and he'd walk them through the process. How to position a pantry for optimal temperature, how to create ventilation, how to build shelving that would last decades. He gave away seeds from his collection, heritage varieties that had proven themselves reliable. Doc Morrison kept his word. He'd spent months interviewing Walter, writing down everything, building techniques, preservation methods, planting schedules, even the psychology of community organization during crisis. By summer, he'd compiled it into a manual that he called the Henrickson Method. The county extension office printed copies. Other communities requested them. But Walter's greatest legacy wasn't the manual or the pantries sprouting up across Montana. It was the shift in thinking. People stopped seeing preparation as paranoia and started seeing it as responsibility. They stopped mocking self-reliance and started practicing it. On Walter's 73rd birthday that September, the town threw him a party at the church, the same building where they'd survived the winter. Someone had made a sign. Everyone laughed at his underground pantry until it saved us all. Walter stood there, uncomfortable with the attention, while people thanked him. When it was his turn to speak, he kept it brief. "I didn't do anything special," he said. "I just remembered being hungry once, and I decided I'd never let it happen again. Not to me, not to anyone I could help. That's not heroism. That's just being human." He paused, looking around at faces he'd known for decades, at the community that had been reborn in crisis. "The real question isn't why I prepared. It's why we all don't."